Dreadweight, the sequel to Cooking Companions, is a game in which we're presented with a whole new group of people, creatures, and a whole lot of lore. And I'll say right up top, full spoilers for all 3 of the games. This isn't just gonna be a summary, it's gonna be a deep dive. And I was originally gonna include in this video a full timeline that included all of the games, but that plus explaining the lore behind just this game ended up being way too long. But if this video does well and that's something that people are interested in, I can make a separate full timeline video that includes all the games as well. So while Cooking Companions and its DLC were mainly based on the Slavic folklore of Baba Yaga, Dreadweight throws not only even more folklore into the mix, but real-world history as well. As a very brief summary to fill in anyone who hasn't played it or refresh the minds of people who have, this game is split between the perspective of Baba Yaga, who is on the warpath against Kurt for what he did to her with Ivan, and the main character you play as, a woman who wakes up outside without fully knowing how or why and is escorted to a mansion owned by Kurt, where she is formally introduced to his employees, the accountant Renata, the doctor Dimitri, and the bodyguard Gisela. Shortly after, Baba Yaga arrives trying to get in, which throws everyone into action. You also meet the ghost of a duck and a rabbit in the halls, casual, who want you to either kill the witch in the duck's case or kill Kurt in the rabbit's case. Baba Yaga starts picking people off one at a time and asks you to help her kill, while Kurt wants you to kill Baba Yaga. What a pickle! We eventually find out that you, Renata, and Gisela all had your memories wiped and that Kurt is undying and also gave that power to you all and Dimitri. But in the end, Baba Yaga digs up a box that Kurt hid that contains bodies and an egg with a needle in it, finds him, and breaks the egg, causing him to rapidly age and die. Alright, pretty clear. Okay, maybe not, but let's start with the basics of the folklore that Dreadweight is referencing, and then we'll set the scene from there. So Baba Yaga is always putting Kurt's name in quotes because his actual name is Koshchei, commonly known as Koshchei the Deathless or Koshchei the Immortal. Like Baba Yaga, Koshchei is a common antagonist in Russian folklore, and there are many versions of his story. One story he appears in, The Death of Koshchei the Deathless, otherwise known as Maria Morevna, involves a man named Ivan discovering Koshchei chained up in his wife's basement, being tricked into giving him water which revitalizes him. Koshchei flees, and then when Ivan's trying to chase Koshchei, he's eventually tipped off that he'll need to steal a horse from Baba Yaga to be able to catch up to him. Now, a lot has been altered here. In the folklore, it's never Koshchei who tells him to get the horse, and there's a lot more that's also been changed. But there's definitely enough to pinpoint that that's why they reference Ivan stealing a horse in the game. Dreadweight alluding to this folklore was also hinted at in the Cooking Companions Nightmare mode, where entering certain combinations unlocks dialogue where Potato says that the spirits have been whispering, asking how old some mystery person is, and asking if water really did the trick. Also saying he's improved upon Baba Yaga's methods and wondering if he'll share the secret with Potato. Now, I think the water bit was just a point to the next game being about Koshchei and Ivan, especially since it's in Nightmare mode, which isn't supposed to be taken too seriously. And you'd also get a better understanding of why I think that if I put together a full timeline, but I don't know, man, it could have happened, I guess. Anyway, Koshchei's stories also often involve him being so afraid to die that he uses a spell to prevent his death by putting his soul into a needle, which he hides inside of an egg, inside of a duck, inside of a hare, inside of a chest, which is buried under an oak tree on an island. The thought being that if someone opened the chest, the hare would run, and if you killed the hare, the duck would fly away. But if you got the egg out of the duck, Koshchei would be weakened, and if you broke the needle, hundreds of years would be forced upon him in an instant, killing him. Now, if you're thinking the whole duck inside of a rabbit thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense, you're right, which is why instead of the rabbit running out of the chest when it's opened, they just find the disgusting corpses of a duck and a rabbit. And there's even a scene in the game where Clover threatens to crack open your rib cage and sew Max inside of you, which unfortunately might give us a much clearer image of what Baba Yaga found inside that chest. Though it's possible that that was just a nod to the story and that they are really just 2 separate corpses in there. So all that's pretty one-to-one. That's why Max and Clover are a duck and a rabbit, and that's why Baba Yaga is on the hunt for that egg. And why, when she cracks it, peep the needle by the way, he instantly ages and dies. But what about some of the more subtle things we're given in the game? Let's start at the beginning of the game, where Baba Yaga arrives at a stranger's house in Zakopane. The man, Jarek, who's designed after the game's executive producer, Joshua Athena, remarks how she's completely dry despite how it's been raining for days. A tip of the hat to the storms that Baba Yaga brings with her. Baba Yaga thinks about how much Zakopane has changed since she was last there, which we know from Kurt's dialogue was decades ago, since the canon ending to the last game was the one where she left the cabin to go on a global massacre, which started in Zakopane. Jarek brings up Judge Liuz, who was the judge that summoned Baba Yaga to court, and who we find out through Lettuce was killed when he came to arrest her following her not making a court appearance. Having gotten sort of a rep for herself, Jarek tries to kill her, but the poor fool uses a gun, which Kurt later says doesn't really work on Baba Yaga. When she awakens from having blacked out, she's covered in blood, and we can assume that Jarek, and potentially others, are probably not doing too great. But why does she keep blacking out and coming to with blood on her hands? For that, I want to turn to the Malleus Maleficarum, which is a very important book in this game that we'll get more into a little bit later. But a big part of the Malleus Maleficarum, as well as real-world beliefs in the time of the witch trials, is that witches have made a pact with and are influenced by the devil. And I think this very well may be the case with Baba Yaga. Now, that's not to say that there are any sort of religious implications tied to that. You could even replace the devil with evil or the hunger. Whichever term you prescribe, I think that when she blacks out, it's a higher evil taking over. It's this evil that chops up the bodies, goes on killing sprees, and more. And in a neat way, this reflects how Baba Yaga is depicted differently in different tales, in some being a kind old woman who helps the hero, and in others being a heartless killing machine. And during the time that Raziel was being kept in the cabin, all the way up to the death of the group in Cooking Companions, I think she was really trying to reform her ways and keep the evil at bay, but would relapse into her old ways against her will. And once Potato finally succeeded in convincing her to regress back into her old ways, she started blacking out and losing control more and more. But wait, in Baba Yaga's mind, Rina also shows up. Now, the character of Rina definitely has a lot of mystery surrounding her, and I would want to dive deeper into that in a video that covers the other games. I got the impression that Rina and Baba Yaga were a lot more connected than the others, with possibly even a familial tie. And while Deirdre has said that none of the Chompettes had ever encountered or knew Baba Yaga prior to the basement incident, this was in 2022, and thinks that might get retconned. But regardless, overall I believe Rina is the utmost representation of Baba Yaga's guilt, constantly calling her a traitor and voicing how betrayed she feels and what a monster you are. Things that Baba Yaga thinks about herself, especially now that she's given in to Potato. It's almost as if Baba Yaga can feel her eyes burning into her, always watching, always judging. But the Chompettes that Potato summons are not the same ones as in the cabin, since the goodbye ending of Chompettes' Origins was the canon one, in which we can see that the Chompettes were finally released when Baba Yaga left the cabin. In fact, in Dread Wait, if you choose the route of going back to the cabin when presented with a choice, they're still not there. And when they show up, Baba Yaga even asks if they're real. But no, they're not. They're a trick of the mind forged by Potato. In fact, there are little slip-ups that show that something's off with them. Baba Yaga notes that Cabbage seemed different, is confused that Bread's puns are improving, and Bread starts to call Onion Oleg before quickly correcting himself. And even now, a small part of Baba Yaga's subconscious is still desperately fighting back, which is why a couple of the Chompettes quietly plead with you to not listen to Potato and just go home before being interrupted by Potato stirring. Potato represents evil and hunger and has almost entirely consumed you, which is even reflected in the inventory. During the main character's parts, the heart will be shown inside their body in the inventory menu, but during Baba Yaga's parts, the heart is shown inside Potato. Baba Yaga is controlled by Potato, but we can still see her subconscious struggling to fight back. But let's jump from Baba Yaga to the other characters. Can you see why I need to make this 2 videos? Dimitri was the first one recruited by Kurt, and he gives us an idea of when this game takes place. In a conversation with him, he says the Americans are colonizing Vietnam and the Vietnamese are defending their home, so we can set this game sometime between 1965 and 1975, since US soldiers were sent to Vietnam in 1965 and the Vietnam War ended in 1975. Dimitri is a Slavic and generally Russian name, which is why the main character has a hard time remembering it and why he says it's not a very common name here. Dimitri's story is that Kurt brought him over from likely Russia to help him with his experiments. Dimitri is in love with Kurt, and while he has Kurt's undying curse, which we know from him reminding Kurt that he didn't refuse to ingest one of Kurt's hairs, and Gisela saying she's seen Dimitri come back from the dead, he importantly doesn't have the memory wipe procedure. I say this because 1, Kurt admits that he needs help performing the procedure and can't do it himself, and 2, because Baba Yaga says that Dimitri and Kurt are the only true friends in the mansion. Dimitri is 30 years old and has been a doctor for 12 years regardless of how young he looks, and Deirdre said they based him off of media like The Good Doctor, where someone's not taken seriously because of how young they look, and in Dimitri's ending, you even thank him for being a good doctor. Dimitri is a bit blinded by love, ignoring the fact that Kurt patronizes him and threatens to throw him down a well for not performing the memory wipe procedure on Renata, in addition to the general moral corruptness going on. But there are some things that Dimitri is ignorant of as well. Dimitri thinks of Kurt as a brilliant scientist, but chalks everything that Kurt does up purely to science, not fully knowing about the darker rituals taking place or even the ancient laboratory that Kurt uses. In fact, Baba Yaga tells Kurt that Dimitri would be ashamed if he knew what Kurt was actually doing to achieve everything he has. It's also possible that Kurt had some hand in Dimitri's parents dying, since there's a specific line Dimitri says about wishing his parents could see where he is now, but them being cremated, and Kurt has ashes around the house, but considering how many victims Kurt has had, it's hard to say for certain. When you tell Dimitri about Max and Clover, he says it reminds him of the book Animal Farm, which is a book by George Orwell that serves as an allegory for the Russian Revolution of 1917, and critiques revolution and totalitarianism and other forms of government, asserting, among other things, the belief that with power, corruption is unavoidable. This not only ties into the political subplot of this game, which we'll get more into later, but mirrors Clover's situation. In the book, Manor Farm is run by Mr. Jones, an alcoholic that runs the farm into the ground and is meant to represent Russian Tsar Nicholas II. Eventually, the animals stage a rebellion, chasing Mr. Jones out and creating their own system of government and commandments. However, a pig named Napoleon, who represents Stalin, goes power-hungry and takes over, eventually ending up in the same spot as Mr. Jones, having made the farm even worse than it originally was. Now, this is a huge oversimplification of the book, and I actually really recommend reading it. It's chilling. But if you'll remember, Clover wants Kurt dead, and in Clover's ending, we can see her buried in Kurt's research, learning everything she can in hopes to one day take over the world, and ending up getting entirely consumed by it instead. Again, demonstrating one driving out the current power only to take their place and become corrupt themselves. Also, Clover is the name of one of the horses in Animal Farm, so that's fun. But on to Kurt's second recruit, Renata. Renata was Kurt's first human test subject for memory wiping, and him specifying human and later saying that there were 2 test subjects before Renata and Gisela lead me to believe that the rabbit and duck were the first 2. We know from talking to Renata that she was thrown in prison for listening to foreign broadcasts, and we can find a letter to Kurt from Dimitri under the bed warning Kurt that she must not remember anything from her time in prison, telling him not to let running water get too loud and not to lock any doors in the mansion. From this information, we can piece together a more detailed backstory. When German troops invaded Poland in 1939, the Nazi state made a new law that forbade German citizens from listening to outside broadcasts. In 1950, the secret police of East Germany was formed, called the Ministry for State Security, but more commonly known as Stasi. The Stasi were basically informants who would rat out people they deemed to be performing political espionage, including citizens listening to foreign broadcasts. This beautifully parallels the witch hunts in that everyday people were encouraged to report their neighbors for any behavior they deemed suspicious, the accused parties often receiving an equally unfair trial. But what about that comment in the letter about not letting running water get too loud? Well, in 1951, the Stasi took over the Soviet basement prison and conducted extreme interrogations there, performing water torture and extreme cell isolation, among other things. So Renata was likely held in the Stasi prison and tortured before Kurt was somehow able to illegally release her from prison, which I say because the letter insists that if she remembers anything about being released from prison, she'll go to the police. It's not uncommon for traumatized people to be so brainwashed and afraid of repercussions that they go back to their abusers if they feel they've betrayed them. And Renata wouldn't feel like she would need to go to the police and report herself if she had stayed for the full duration of her sentence. Before wiping her memories, Kurt warns her of the side effects she might get, and it seems like losing her sense of smell and in turn taste were likely one of them, as she can't smell the molding food in the kitchen. I don't even think the ones who are undying need to eat anymore, as comments are made about no one using the kitchen, not to mention the moldy food, and when Renata asks if you're hungry and you say no, she's not surprised. Renata also tells you that it was a year after she was hired that Gisela was hired. While Gisela says she was working at a lumber yard when she met Kurt, there's definitely more to the story than that, as once she regains her memory, she mentions the casualties she's caused that can never be forgiven. Gisela is a Germanic name meaning pledge, perhaps a nod to how a bodyguard pledges themselves to protect someone. And she likes the German children's show Sandman, which first aired in East Germany, though a West German version existed as well, so we can safely assume she's German. Considering she mentions painful memories of casualties she caused, you might tie this to her having fought in World War II, but I'm not entirely convinced. If World War II was from 1939 to 1945 and she was made undying a year after Renata, sometime after 1951, that would have been a good number of years after the end of the war. Which is totally possible, I'm not saying it's not. But I also think it's possible that Gisela might have fought in the East German Uprising of 1953, which was an uprising in response to the government's intention to increase construction workers' production without increasing wages, and was violently suppressed by Soviet troops and tanks and East German police, resulting in a massive number of casualties. If Renata was held in the Stasi prison for a year before being brought to the mansion, Gisela showing up 1 year later in 1953 and wanting her memories of what she had done wiped lines up with this. However, it's also 100% possible that she had been holding on to what she did in World War II for years, especially considering how much she is unbothered by violence. Regardless, to forget her violent past, she makes a deal to get her memory wiped by Kurt in exchange for acting as his permanent permanent bodyguard, and also becomes undying. Gisela is actually quite aware of the circumstances, revealing that she's seen Dimitri come back to life, affirming that Kurt's memories will seep into the main character, which we can assume she's experienced herself, and being unbothered that Kurt goes off to look for a decrepit tome that has an incantation to weaken a witch's bones. She's very chill about it. At one point, the main character comes across Gisela after the witch cuts her eye out, and the art style completely changes to look like it comes straight out of a retro fighting game. I can't pinpoint exactly which one, which drives me insane, but it gives me big Street Fighter 2 or King of Fighters energy. And actually, there's a character in several of the King of Fighter games named Lana, who's also a strong woman in green with blue hair, and her story is strikingly similar. Lana was born into the Orochi bloodline, which meant that she could be triggered into a condition called the Riot of Blood. And after a disagreement with her father when Lana was younger, a leader of the Orochi clan triggered the Riot of Blood in Lana, causing her to kill her entire village, including her parents, before it was contained. She lost all memory of what happened and was eventually adopted and raised to be a soldier. Note the eye patch. When she gets older, the Riot of Blood is triggered in her once again, but once she is subdued and Orochi is sealed away, she regains all of her memories of what she did, being horrified with herself. So I would be pretty surprised if this wasn't a King of Fighters nod, but if someone knows of a game that's more of a one-for-one with this shot, let me know in the comments. It's also in this scene that Gisela says she's heading west, her one eye and unending life now mirroring Baba Yaga. But if you get her ending, she comes back to the manor to pack up some things and instead says she's gonna head somewhere warmer to track down a woman said to be around the same age as Baba Yaga, whose knowledge can be used to kill her. If I had to guess, I think she's going to Greece to find Hecate, the Greek goddess of magic, crossroads, witchcraft, sorcery, ghosts, and necromancy. Seems like a good candidate to know how to kill an ancient witch, live somewhere warmer, and as a cherry on top, she's mentioned in the Metamorphoses by Roman poet Ovid. The word metamorphosis is pivotal in this series. It's an achievement in Dreadweight when you pick Potato over Rhina. It's an achievement in Chompet Origins when the Chompets gain sentience. It's the book by Franz Kafka that Anatoly is not actually reading. It's a big deal. But why? Well, there's the classic definition of metamorphosis, a change of the form or nature of a thing or person into a completely different one, which I mean, pretty much everyone goes through in this series. The Chompets definitely go through a metamorphosis. Baba Yaga goes through a mental metamorphosis and also changes physical states. Kurt both goes through a metamorphosis and forces metamorphoses upon others. Even the world is going through a metamorphosis as we see and read about various historical events playing out. So that's one part of it. However, remember how I said that Anatoly is holding Franz Kafka's book, The Metamorphosis? The Metamorphosis is about a man who wakes up one day to find he's turned into a bug. As to be expected, his family is horrified by his appearance, confining him to his room and gradually becoming more and more distant, separating him both literally and emotionally, not only from his family, but to society as a whole. Unable to communicate and connect with the outside world, and feeling the dissonance of his thoughts not matching up with his body, he struggles to find the meaning of holding on to his humanity. Also, being a bug is a metaphor for being different, having any quality or illness that society deems as abnormal. Also, the man's name is Gregor. Just saying. We see the parallels? Baba Yaga is completely isolated from society due to her appearance and demeanor, with her interior being unaligned with her exterior. The cooking companions group are at first terrified of her appearance, but grow fond of her once they get to know her. And this extreme isolation makes her have to fight to hold on to her humanity. A fight that becomes harder the more alienated she feels, but is easier when shown compassion. The Chompets try to help, keeping her company, helping her stay distracted, and discouraging her from eating meat. But Potato only serves to fuel her rejection of humanity, wanting her to instead embrace the bug and give humanity something to really fear. While we're at it, here's another thing that mentions metamorphosis. The Malleus Maleficarum. Told you we'd get into it. During the exchange between Baba Yaga and Kurt at the end, we find out that Kurt was very likely involved in the witch trials, which in Poland was really active from 1650 to 1750. This would also align with him being hundreds of years old, like he is in the folklore. This conversation actually holds many references that can be directly tied back to the Malleus Maleficarum, a real-life book on witches and how to identify, convict, and execute them that is found both in Baba Yaga's cabin and in Kurt's closet in the mansion, along with a picture of Baba Yaga that is actually her voice actress, Carol Stanzione. Baba Yaga talks about how Kurt always blamed women, a theme that was echoed in the Malleus Maleficarum and the witch trials themselves, the book claiming that women are more susceptible to demonic possession due to, among other things, their promiscuous nature, vanity, tendency towards lying, and lack of intellect and physical and spiritual strength. Cool! Baba Yaga also brings up how Kurt claimed he went sterile from them when it was really his own doing, likely caused by his experimental rituals. This is in reference to how the Malleus Maleficarum also accused witches of having the power to steal a man's penis. BRB while I take up witchcraft. But really, in reality, the women targeted were often ones that went against the grain of what society expected of them. Women who spoke up, women who lived alone, women who practiced herbal medicine. It could even be the smallest of things. In Cooking Companions, we find a notice that Baba Yaga received that warns that they've received several complaints from a woman that says Baba Yaga is causing a public disturbance and frightening her nephew. Her offenses include erratic shuffling, sneering, and babbling incoherently. Now, yes, Baba Yaga is a witch, but it demonstrates the very real effect that the witch hunts had on people, causing a paranoia and distrust of those who were different, and Baba Yaga being isolated from the rest of society didn't help the town's distrust of her. Kind of a snake eating its own tail situation. There are several other ties between Baba Yaga and the things witches are accused of in the Malleus Maleficarum as well. Cannibalism, for obvious reasons, shifting their appearance, which we see she's fully capable of, conversing with the devil, which I mentioned earlier that I think Potato is semi-symbolic of, being able to control the weather, like the storms that happen in the games and during the Summer of Rain, the presence of what was known as a witch's mark, which was a mole, blemish, or unusual scar thought to be given to the witch by the devil himself, which could explain why Baba Yaga only has one working eye with a large scar across the other, and infanticide, which could very well be a tie to the Portuguese ghost named Baby in the Cooking Companions wiki page, whose appearance is always preceded by a baby crying. So a whole lot more was pulled from the Malleus Maleficarum than you might have originally thought. One person we haven't talked about yet is the main character you play as, who from now on I'll refer to as the MC for short. We get dropped hints on our character's profession throughout the game, her remembering looking at documents downtown and pulling up to the docks, the constant use of the word interrogation, how she tells Gisela that she could put a good word in and get her in front of the right judge, her telling Renata that it's an investigation now, her saying she bets Kurt's folder is a kilometer high, but eventually it just straight up tells you that she was investigating Kurt, who likely also knows that he's actually Crochet, considering she uses the same quotation marks as Baba Yaga in the flashback. Judging by the time period the game takes place and the MC telling Gisela that she's worked with guns, landmines, and grenades before, I believe that the MC is a part of the National People's Army, or NVA, which were the armed forces of the German Democratic Republic at the time. The NVA consisted of 4 branches, which included the ground forces, the Navy, the Air Force, and the border troops. And they were military trained, which would account for why she would both be investigating someone and have experience with multiple types of weapons. This character wasn't based on, but might have been inspired by the character Renata, a Polish police officer that appeared in one of Baba Yaga's dreams in Nightmare Mode of Cooking Companions. This isn't her though, seeing as Renata was Polish and the MC is German, in one ending arresting Kurt for conspiracy against Stralsund. And Renata was only added to the game as a Kickstarter reward. She's even since been removed from the game, instead being replaced with the scene of Kurt being given the mushroom stew from Baba Yaga's point of view, which I believe was Dear Dream trying to further disconnect the two characters. The MC, like the rest, has the Undying Curse, and at the beginning of the game you can even see exactly when she was snuck one of Kurt's hairs to ingest when Dimitri gives her a glass of water. Also, if you're wondering how all of them can be undying when Baba Yaga fully kills Renata and Dimitri, we learn from Onion that Baba Yaga ripped their souls from their bodies in order to permanently kill them, which is also what happens to the MC in the end. The last person we have yet to discuss is Kurt himself. Kurt is a lich, which is an undead creature that is the result of usually some type of wizard performing a ritual to give up their soul in exchange for a soul artifact that grants them eternal life, unless the soul artifact is destroyed. And we can learn from a conversation with the Baba Yaga that Kurt is the first and only lich. We also know that Kurt and Baba Yaga have a bit of a history. Kurt at one point goes to Baba Yaga's cabin to see how she do what she do. And if you didn't catch the scenes in your playthrough, Baba Yaga poisons Kurt using real-world mushrooms in a stew. Among these are death caps, which are actually the most poisonous of all known mushrooms and cause liver and kidney failure, fool's web cap, which also causes kidney failure, and the last little dude causes abdominal pain, sickness, and diarrhea, blurred vision, and labored breathing, which is kind of child's play compared to the other two. She eventually gets bored and lets him leave, where after a very long period of time he finally dies, but is shocked to come back to life 5 minutes later, fully cured. Due to his reaction in this flashback, this very well could have been the first time he was revived, and thus began his new lichy life. Liches are often depicted as skelemen, and that's because even if their souls can last forever, their bodies cannot. So to maintain a human appearance, they would need to use magic. At one point in the game, Kurt tells you he needs to change, and we see that he's Bones, which is also hinted at by Potato towards the beginning. But how come he's not Bones a moment before? Not Bones? Bones. I believe this is because when Kurt says he needs to change, he doesn't mean change his clothes. After all, he says he's had to change quite a few times since you got here, and the MC is confused because his outfit looks the same. But it's really his body he needs to change, and since he likely doesn't do that in front of people too often, he learns that when he does that, the MC can see his true form. This might also be fueled by the link the two have, with the MC having ingested his hair and receiving the curse from him, like how his memories are seeping into her mind. And I like to think that Kurt saying he's had to change a few times since you got here means that Baba Yaga's just been killing him over and over. I mean, later on, after talking to Kurt, you run into Gisela, who describes how Kurt had just gotten stabbed by Baba Yaga and came back, and we know he's chilling in the other room. And Baba Yaga knows she can't fully kill him until she finds the egg, so I like to think she's just having fun shaking him a little every once in a while, making him have to change his body again. It's a good way to keep someone busy. How does she eventually find that egg, though? Well, she was the one who planted the radio that we picked up at the beginning of the game and has been using that to listen in. And when Kurt asks you if the witch has spoken to you, regardless of what you answer, he'll bring up the oak tree, which is exactly what the witch needed to hear. Baba Yaga isn't the only sneaky snake, though, as Kurt has had his fair share of secrets as well. When talking to him, he offers to show you the lab, but then delays the offer, saying that Dimitri hasn't cleaned it yet. But it's possible that the lab was where your mind-wiping procedure took place, and we know from Dimitri's note the importance of not jogging the mind-wipe patient's memories. So Kurt may have realized that this would be too soon to take the MC to where her procedure took place. Or it's fully possible Dimitri hasn't cleaned up from the procedure and he doesn't want an investigator to see that evidence. He also says he doesn't hire someone to maintain the manor because he can't find anyone locally, when in reality he can't risk having someone snooping around the place. After all, he's got a secret laboratory and ceremony room, which is actually designed after the painting Caché the Immortal by Viktor Vasnetsov. By the way, something I thought was kind of neat was the sword by the throne, because the sword of state was used to symbolize a monarch's god-given power to use the might of the state and deadly warfare against its enemies in order to protect the state, which I think does a nice job mirroring Kurt's self-proclaimed right to play God and fight using whatever means necessary. But that's not all he's hiding. When we ask what job pays so well, he answers scientist, but both Renata and Dimitri confirmed he doesn't have a lot of money, and it's possible that what he does have he might take from people who come to his mansion. After all, we find this letter in his desk of someone who visited the manor back when Clover and Max were still alive and kicking, writing home, and since the letter is still in Kurt's possession, one must assume they didn't make it home. However, money isn't what Kurt is after. Kurt wants to be known for advancing science to an unimaginable scale by perfecting a scientific method to prevent death. He's already made the ones at the manor undying, but it's likely the process still involves a ritual, which he's likely trying to eliminate the need for, and he hasn't yet perfected it seeing as there are still side effects. But the most dangerous part of it all is how his research would be used for political gain. Both Kurt and Baba Yaga have their hands in the political world. We can see an example of Baba Yaga meddling in political affairs to cause war and chaos in a note she wrote 3 years prior to Chompet Origins, so around 1860. This is the recipe for mustard gas, which was first used by the Germans in 1917 during World War I. Along with the mustard gas recipe is a checklist with send letter checked off. This, along with a letter in Kurt's closet warning him that she's been sending letters to scientists, politicians, and the police, and the achievement when you find this note being future horror, implies that Baba Yaga was sending recipes for chemical warfare to Germany. We also find various political letters and books around Kurt's mansion, which are all actually real-world documents pertaining to the Cold War. This one, found in the ceremony room, which was a 1953 letter from President Eisenhower to the Chancellor of West Germany, pause to compare. A book that contains George Kennan's long telegram that was sent from Moscow to Washington in 1946 and described the motives of Soviet communism and how the US should respond, in which he also wrote, "It is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies," which seems to mirror Kurt's preference of slow growth investments, which is referenced multiple times. There are also 2 letters in a book from 1962, both real-world letters from Council of Ministers Chairman Khrushchev to President Kennedy, the latter being a part of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Finally, there's a diplomatic paper from the conferences at Malta and Yalta in 1945, and the selection read in the game was said by Stalin, who Baba Yaga notes that Kurt hated. In Kurt's ending where the MC arrests him, among other things, he's accused of conspiracy against Stralsund, conspiracy to conduct international terrorism, and 50 56 separate assassination attempts. And we also get an idea of what his secret getting out to the political world would do, with undying permanent board members and politicians being created and future generations being powerless against them. Interestingly enough, this wasn't the first time it's been hinted that the in-world political landscape has been affected by these two. In the Mariah ending of Cooking Companions, Mariah joins a committee that comes to discover many historical events had been swayed either directly or indirectly by atypical beings. So while that ending is not canon, that moment definitely foreshadowed this game quite nicely. While Kurt and Baba Yaga share common ground and are both dangerous to the world, they stand on opposite sides, with Baba Yaga drawing power from the natural world and Kurt drawing power from the world of science. This is even reflected in their abodes, Baba Yaga's wooden cabin having warm earthy tones, herbs, and books on surviving off the land, while Kurt's mansion has multiple labs, destruction from experiment accidents, a chemical scent, and even lamps that look like the symbol for an atom. And in the end, nature triumphs. Trying to attain what Baba Yaga had through unnatural means destroyed Kurt's home, his body, and his chance of survival. Kurt endured the weight of dread he felt during the dreaded wait for Baba Yaga to catch him. But while he wanted so badly to be like Baba Yaga, she only saw him as dead weight. Do you get it? Mm-hmm. I believe the canon ending is the one where you open the box in Kurt's office for Baba Yaga, which I think might contain all of his research papers that Baba Yaga is going to destroy, seeing as Potato asked to read the research papers that are at the time in her possession. And then the MC does die, Kurt does die, Gisela likely does come back for his stuff to set off on an expedition, and Baba Yaga heads off to her next destination. Where's she going though? It's a bit hard to say. Potato saying they'll probably have guns leads me to believe this is a country they're talking about, not like a witch coven. And Potato saying that they're the oldest would lead me to believe that they're referring to the oldest country. Now, the actual oldest country is Egypt, which was founded in 3150 BCE, but dates back to 6000 BCE. But if these games were going to continue the trend of ooching further along the timeline of real-world historic events, I could also see them maybe talking about Iran or Iraq, which both also make the top oldest countries list. But also, all folklore is fair game, and now Greek mythology might be fair game too, so it's pretty dang hard to say. I mean, it's pretty dang hard for me to tell what's important in general in this series sometimes. Like, the pendant seems like it'd be important, but it's actually just a Dark Souls reference. And the well seems like it'd be important, but it's actually just a lesson not to jump down wells. To me, the biggest mysteries that I have yet to feel confident about are some of the letters. Like this one, which says she'll be here in about a week and says that the reader will forget about this, but that they need to keep reading. It seems to only make sense that this is to Kurt, considering it says your mansion, but why Kurt would forget about Baba Yaga arriving is puzzling. Here's my best guess. We don't know how long the MC was out for while preparations for the procedure were made or during her recovery. So it's possible that Kurt realized Baba Yaga was coming before he boarded the boat, then he got caught by the MC and was like, well shoot, I gotta mind wipe this gal. But maybe mind wiping also has an effect on his memories. So either Dimitri wrote him a note or he wrote himself a note prior to the procedure to read after it. I don't know, that's what I got. I don't know why he would forget something so important otherwise. Then there's this letter. Now we can assume that one of these names is Kurt, but who's the other one? She will follow you to the ends of the earth makes it seem like it's for Kurt, but you remember how bad it got a few decades ago seems to indicate that this is someone who also experienced the happenings of a few decades ago. But the other three seem too young for that, and who would know that Baba Yaga is writing these letters? This might be Ivan. If he wrote this letter around the time that she wrote the mustard gas note, that'd be 1860. Then if Kurt told him to steal the horse and leave after that, then his death would still fit into the decades window that Kurt provided. Note how he doesn't say centuries, and Ivan is clearly not undying like Kurt. Maybe we'll delve further into that in a full timeline video. Finally, there's the mystery of these two letters. I pair them together because the second one is using very specific language from the first that are in no other letters in the game. All my love, duck, rabbit, and dearest. Now the only other time we see this writing in the series is in the Butcher of Zakopane's letters, but I think the spelling would have been worse. Like, there's no way they would have used the correct iteration of there, and I can't for the life of me fit the Butcher going to Stralsund in the timeline. I don't think it makes sense. So the only other thing that makes sense to me is that the person who wrote these letters is the same person trying to replicate what they said before, but after possibly being lobotomized or suffering the effects of an experiment gone wrong. Which seems well and good, but in the first letter, Max and Clover are alive, and like I said before, Kurt says that Renata is the first test on a human with 2 previous test subjects before her, assumingly Clover and Max, with Clover being the first. But then, what happened to this person? I don't know, man. Maybe it's a case of things being worded strangely strangely, or maybe Kurt's lying to Renata about being the first human test subject, or maybe the duck and rabbit in the letter aren't Max and Clover, or aren't even alive, though it seems strange that someone wouldn't be able to recognize and tell that this is a ghost. I can't make sense of it. If you have any ideas, let me know what you think. As well as any other theories or lingering questions you may have about Dreadweight. Also, do genuinely leave a comment if you'd like me to do a full timeline that covers the whole series. That's the only way I'll be able to know that people are actually interested in seeing that. And a huge thanks as always to my patrons for helping allow me to be able to make these videos. I'm off to go ice my head after all that theorizing, but I'll see you all in the next one. Bye!
Gambana is the wonder why she didn't come to play. Gaming vids that'll make you laugh and think and put them on replay. Intelligent, kind of funny, her community's #1. Stick around and kick your feet up. Gambana has just begun.